This is Lecture 58C in the ABCs of Communism series, which accompanies the textbook for Volume 3 next year on Communism in East Asia, Volume 3 of the Bolshevism 2018 version of the ABCs of Communism. And our subject today is the Autochthonous Philippines and Spanish colonization. And we'll pick up the general story where we stopped last time. There was a change in the composition of ceramic assemblages that occurred in the late prehistoric Philippine sites. In the 14th century AD, there appeared glazed ceramics manufactured in Vietnam and Thailand. Chinese ceramic wares appeared during that period, were produced for the proto-proletarian and peasant farmer market. Both exhibit exotic small covered bowls, ewers, candies and bottles, bowls, jarlets, and small saucers. In some sites in the Visayas part of the Philippines and in Mindanao, these kinds of porcelain make up 30% of the export pottery present. All of the materials were found in prehistoric graves that contained several pieces of imported ceramics. Relatively few porcelain sherds are found in the habitation debris. The situation is the opposite with locally manufactured earthenware pottery. Whole earthen vessels are common in graves predating AD 1200. After that date, the whole earthen vessels are rare in burials. On the other hand, earthenware sherds remain common in habitation contexts. Our conclusion must be that locally made earthen vessels were targeting local commoner markets. Porcelain wares were produced for affluent classes. This commercial dichotomy is confirmed by significant changes in the spatial distribution of export wares in archaeological sites over a period of 600 years. The distribution of Chinese wares is quite uneven at first. The early wares can be found in specific localities in just a few larger sites, while many other contemporaneous sites do not have any porcelain. By about the 14th century AD, however, export wares become much more widely distributed, reflecting growing bourgeois and petty bourgeois classes of consumers. The distinction of finer and coarser wares correlates with the spatial distribution of these wares. Fine wares are more common in larger coastal sites of a gentrified class, while coarser wares predominate in smaller and non-coastal locations of working men and women. Autochthonous Philippine society at the time of contact with the Spaniards witnessed a broad variety of sociocultural evolutionary stage formations ranging from primitive communism to the early slave stage. These formations exhibit a broad spectrum of roles assigned to women. Philippine society was not always patriarchal. There was a time when women were treated as equally as men. Pre-colonial Filipinas, unlike their modern-day counterparts, enjoyed the same privileges, rights, and opportunities as did men. Before the coming of the Spaniards, women were active in business, politics, and even religion. Sister Mary John Menanzan reports pre-colonial families were as eager for the birth of a daughter as for the birth of a son. The daughter was considered an important member of the family, and the groom would have to give a dowry to her family as compensation for her loss. The dowry could be in the form of gifts to parents and relatives. The groom was also required to render bride service by working for his wife's family for a period of time. After marriage, the Filipina did not lose her name. Among the Tagalogs, the husband usually took the bride's name, if she was especially distinguished due to family connections or personal merits. Pre-colonial Philippine society did not consider virginity a special value. Unwed mothers were not condemned. They did not lose the chance for a good marriage since they were considered to have proven their capacity for motherhood. While premarital sex was not a taboo, there were customs that punished promiscuity and prostitution. But children were treated equally, and pre-colonial families were neither overprotective with girls nor lenient with boys. Daughters were brought up in the same way as the sons, and no one was exempted from work training. Legitimate male children got the same inheritance as their female siblings. In the family, husbands and wives were also equal. Husbands treated their wives as companions and not as slaves or whores. The wife was also financially independent since she retained the property she owned before marriage. Both the husband and the wife had the right and practice of filing for divorce. The grounds for divorce were childlessness, infidelity, or failure to fulfill obligations to the family. Divorce entailed the return of the bride's price by her family if she was at fault, and if the husband is at fault, he lost rights to its return. Child custody was not a problem since the children were divided between the two regardless of sex, and property acquired after marriage was also split equally. In some cases, the guilty party had to pay fines. The married woman juggled between managing the home, taking care of the children, at the same time helping her husband in earning the family's livelihood. She often played an essential role in the family's economic stability and in improving the family's finances by engaging in agriculture and in trade with the Chinese merchants. Pre-colonial Filipinas were considered as reliable trade collaborates. Thus, women's signatures were often required to validate contracts. Austronesian migrants having bronze or brass tools may have introduced the earliest metal tools of the Philippines. However, even if this proves to be the case, by 500 BC the early slave stage kingdoms were well on the way to metallurgy and would have been well prepared to accept the technical knowledge. Metallurgy brought changes in the lifestyle of early Filipinos. The new technology stabilized temporarily the system of slavery, creating new specialist communities. Archaeological evidence proves unity of culture from site to site throughout the archipelago. Ceramic technology advanced hand in hand with metallurgy. The Iron Age of the Philippines exhibits trade between Tamil Nadu and the Philippine Islands. The Philippines' main island is referred to by some historians as the island of Chryse, the Golden One. This was the name given by ancient Greek writers to an island rich in gold east of India. Pomponius Mela, Marinus of Tyre, and Periplus of the Erythraean Sea mentioned this main island in 100 BC. In these sources, the Philippines are the Indian Suvarnadvipa, island of gold. Josephus calls the Philippines Aurea and equates them and their principal island with the biblical Ophir, from where the ships of Tyre and Solomon brought back gold and other trade items. The Visayan Islands, particularly Cebu, had earlier encounter with the Greek traders in 21 AD. Ptolemy locates the islands of Chryse east of the Crucis Chersonesus, the Golden Peninsula, that is, the Malay Peninsula, north of Chryse. In the Periplus was Thin, which some consider the first European reference to China. In 200 BC, there arose a practice of using gold eye covers and then gold facial orifice covers to adorn the dead, resulting in an increase of ancient gold finds. During China's feudal stage, the Qin dynasty and the Tang dynasty were well aware of the golden lands far to the south. The Buddhist pilgrim I Sing mentions Qinzhou, Isle of Gold, in the archipelago south of China, on his way back from India. Medieval Muslims refer to the gold-rich eastern islands of the Malay archipelago as the kingdoms of Zabag and Wakwak. This is the location of the Philippines and eastern Indonesia. Now we have what I call the post-AD 200 thalassocracies. A thalassocracy is a Greek term meaning sea power. In the Philippines, it is therefore a policy at sea and in the plural similar to the Phoenician network of merchant cities. The name barangay, B-A-R-A-N-G-A-Y, derives from the Malay balangay, or sailboat. The Philippines' barangays were advanced theocratic chiefdoms and or primordial city-states. They were the most advanced organizational forms among indigenous communities in much of the Philippine archipelago at the time of Spanish arrival. The first barangays began as ATCs of 50 to 100 families living in 30 to 100 houses with a total population ranging from 100 to 500 people. Spanish chroniclers describe people in what they named the Philippines as living in a broad spectrum of communities. These were said to range from small tribal agricultural villages through intermediary barangay-sized hamlets, culminating in large ATCs or primordial states. The Spanish they called the largest ones principalities, for lack of any other European polity of similar size and scope. It's interesting that yesterday, on the 12th of June 2017, Telesur reported the introduction of a bill in the Manila Congress to consider a new name for the Philippines that reflects that nation's pre-colonial heritage. At any rate, original barangays were coastal or riverine chiefdoms of Autochthonous and foreign derivation, the latter being Malayo-Polynesian people arriving in the archipelago by boat from elsewhere. Most of the economies of the Philippine Islands were based on people fishing for their supply of protein and for exchange. They traveled mostly by water, up and down rivers and along the coasts. Inland trails always followed river systems. Fresh water for bathing, washing, and drinking came from these rivers. The coastal villages were easily accessible to trade with foreigners, and so mercantilism emerged, and with it a class of merchants and merchant dependents. This business meant contact with Japan, China, India, and Arabia, and naturally these seeds of mercantile capitalism blossomed into more advanced capitalism, and along the way produced new ruling classes from the earlier extant ranks. The barangays in some coastal places in Panay, Manila, Cebu, Jolo, and Butuan were thoroughly cosmopolitan, with trade relations with other countries in Asia, and were the locations of this mercantile capitalist bloom. The highest ranked group transforming into ruling classes was the Datu class. Datu is spelled D-A-T-U, just like it sounds. Some of these polities have remained unhispanicized, mostly Islamicized parts of the Philippines in Mindanao. Now, the ancient Visayan barangays in the Visayas, especially in Cebu, Bohol, and Panay, the Datu were at the top of the barangay social order. That social order was divided into three classes. We have the records written by Spanish chroniclers, but one has to read them with a discerning mind, as the prejudices and ignorance of these writers inundates their reporting. Accordingly, the members of the Tumao class, T-U-M-A-O, including the Datu, are described as nobility by these writers and said to be of pure royal descent, and yet there's no evidence of any kind of royal line in the archaeological record. In the Boxer Codex, they are titled Spanish lords, that is, señores de título. The problem is that in reality there was no feudal system extant in the Philippines. The same interpretive failure exists in Catholic descriptions of those below the Tumao. For example, when they call the Timawa as a vessel warrior class, because there was no class of knights at the time of contact. Nevertheless, the Jesuit priest Francisco Ignacio Alena says the Timawa were the third rank of nobility. The conquistador Miguel de Loarca called them freemen, neither chiefs nor slaves, comparing them to knights because they were required to render military service to the Datu in hunts, land wars, or sea raids. Additional justification for this is that the Timawa paid taxes and tribute and were sometimes called upon for agricultural labor to the Datu, admitting that the personal vassals of the Datu were exempt from such obligations. The latter were characterized by the Boxer Codex as knights and hidalgos. Below the Timawa were the Orapun class of commoners and slaves who rendered services to the Tumao and Timawa. All of this written because the Spanish chroniclers, Catholic priests, could only think in terms of what they knew back home in Spain. The ancient barangays in the Tagalog region. In Luzon, the Catholic chroniclers describe a less stable and more complex social structure in the pre-colonial Tagalog barangays of Manila, Pampanga, and Laguna. They describe them as having more extensive commerce than the barangays of the Visayas. The priests say this was because of Bornean political contacts. However that may have been, they are said to be engaged in farming wet rice for a living. The Tagalogs were described by the Spanish Augustinian friar Martin de Rada as traders, not warriors. The more complex social structure of the Tagalogs was in the process of differentiating when the Spanish colonial force arrived. The Jesuit priest Francisco Colin made an approximate comparison of the Tagalog region with the Visayan social structure in the middle of the AD 1600s. Accordingly, the term datu, lakan, or apo refers to the noble class to which the datu belonged, known as the Maganu class. Any male member of the Maganu class can become a datu by personal achievement. Now, this is hardly a description of a slave or feudal right of hereditary succession. The term timawa, referring to freemen, came into use in the social structure of the Tagalogs 20 years after the coming of the Spaniards. The term, however, was being incorrectly applied to former alapin, that is, commoner and slave class, who have escaped bondage by payment, favor, or flight. Moreover, the Tagalog timawa did not have the military prominence of the Visayan timawa. Any possibly equivalent warrior class in Tagalog society was present only in Laguna, known as the Maharlika class. The priest wrote that at the bottom of the social hierarchy were the members of the Alapin class with two main subclasses. These Alapin owned their own houses, served their masters by paying tribute, or working on their fields, living in their masters' houses as servants and slaves. What we do know is that fragmented ethnic groups had numerous ATCs, or primordial city-states. They had been formed by the assimilation of several small political units known as barangays, where they were headed by a datu, or headman. Some were ruled by a king called a raja. By AD 400, some barangays developed inter-island and international trade. Hindu, Buddhist culture and religion flourished among the upper ranks in this era. Many of them were nominally under the jurisdiction of one of several neighboring empires, although they had established their own independent systems of rule. Among these, the Malay Sri, Vijaya, Javanese Majapahit, Brunei, and Malacca empires. Trading links with Sumatra, Borneo, Thailand, Java, China, India, Arabia, Japan, and the Ryukyu Kingdom flourished during this era. Therefore, we can say that in the Philippines, a thalassocracy based on international trade existed, although of mixed ATC and kingdom types. In their earliest times, trade commodities were jars, metal, salt, and tobacco. In exchange, merchants would trade feathers, rhino horn, hornbill beaks, beeswax, bird's nests, rosin, and rattan. Now, with regard to international trade, by 900 BC, some polities in the Philippines had trade with India. Since at least the 3rd century AD, Filipino peoples were in contact with other Southeast Asian and East Asian nations. Around 300 to 700 AD, the seafaring peoples of the Philippine Islands began to trade with the Indianized kingdoms in the Malay archipelago and the nearby East Asian principalities. This is proven by artistic and architectural influence from both Buddhism and Hinduism. In the period between the 7th century AD to the beginning of the 15th century AD, numerous prosperous centers of trade had emerged. These include the kingdoms of Namayan, Manila Bay, Cebu, Iloilo, Butuan, Sanfotsi, Zabag, Wakwak, Apare, and Hiram Tambak. This trade was conducted with kingdoms in Japan, Korea, China, and Indochina. Now we come to the period of Spanish colonization. Although the archipelago may have been visited before by the Portuguese, the earliest documented European expedition to the Philippines was that led by Ferdinand Magellan in the service of the King of Spain. The expedition first sighted the mountains of Samar at dawn on the 16th of March, 1521. It made landfall the following day at the small uninhabited island of Homonhon at the mouth of the Leyte Gulf. On Easter Sunday, 31 March 1521, at Limasawa Island, southern Leyte, according to Pigafetta's, quote, first voyage around the world, unquote, the name of his book, Magellan solemnly planted a cross on the summit of a hill overlooking the sea. He claimed for the King of Spain possession of the islands he had seen, naming them the archipelago of St. Lazarus. Magellan conquered and sought alliances among the natives, beginning with Datu Zula, the chieftain of Sugbu, that is Cebu today, and took the special pride in converting them to Catholicism. Magellan's expedition got involved in the political rivalries between the Cebuano natives and took part in a battle against Lapu-Lapu, chieftain of Mactan Island, and a mortal enemy of Datu Zula. At dawn on 27 April 1521, Magellan invaded Mactan Island with 60 armed men and 1,000 Cebuano warriors. The invasion was poorly planned and failed on first attempt to land his force on the rocky shores against Lapu-Lapu's army of 1,500 men. Magellan had little choice but to try until he prevailed or accept humiliating defeat, and all that implied for his wider objective. Again, therefore, he waded ashore with his soldiers and attacked the Mactan defenders while leaving Datu Zula and his warriors aboard his ships, unable to watch the Spanish for what they were, common brigands without supernatural power. This was a good thing because the Spanish had seriously underestimated Lapu-Lapu and his men. Magellan was killed, as were 14 of his soldiers. The rest of his men managed to escape and reboard their ships. Now that battle left the expedition without its commander, and with too few crewmen to man 3 ships. So the remaining Spaniards were forced to abandon the Concepcion. And on the remaining 2 ships, Trinidad and Victoria, they sailed to the Spice Islands, that is Indonesia. From there, the expedition split into 2 retreating groups. The Trinidad, commanded by Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa, tried to sail eastward across the Pacific Ocean to the Isthmus of Panama or to Acapulco, but failed and most of the crew died on the way. Survivors of the Trinidad returned to the Spice Islands, where the Portuguese imprisoned them. The Victoria continued sailing westward and managed to return to Spain in 1522. Now this sets up a peculiarly unstable situation because you'll recall that the Borgia Pope had divided the world between the 2 papist powers, Spain and Portugal, by drawing a line. Now that line cut off the promontory of Brazil that sticks out over it, so the Portuguese were allowed to get into that part of the New World. Now the Spaniards are about to confront a situation in 1588 where their foothold in the Philippines is going to become a major political question between the 2 papist powers, and the popes are going to have to get involved again because the Philippines are, of course, in the Old World, and this is Portuguese territory. That's why that first group of sailors that had tried to get back to Spain by going westward were imprisoned when the Portuguese got a hold of them. But at any rate, in 1529, Charles I of Spain assigned his claims to the Indonesian Spice Islands to Portugal in the Treaty of Zaragoza. You'll recall where Zaragoza is in Spain. The Zaragoza Treaty did not stop the colonization of the Philippine archipelago that was now undertaken from New Spain, that is from Mexico. Several subsequent expeditions were dispatched to the Philippine Islands, including the Loaiza in 1525, Cabot in 1526, Saavedras in 1527, Villalobos in 1542, and Legazpi in 1564. Now this last of these expeditions resulted in the discovery of the Tornaviaje, or return trip route to Mexico across the Pacific Ocean. This discovery started the Manila galleon trade, financed by the stolen wealth of the Americas. That wealth and the trade with the Far East via Manila lasted 2.5 centuries. Now this wealth and trade saved the Spanish Empire after the historic defeat of at sea of the Spanish Armada in 1588. And now that was a world-shaking event. I like to think that the contemporary collapse of the U.S. global empire is about to have some kind of similar occurrence where, but at any rate, when the Spanish Armada was financed, it was built at a tremendous cost by the King of Spain with the objective of destroying Protestantism in the Netherlands and the British Islands and taking Queen Elizabeth back to Rome for a public burning. Now, in reality, what happened, as you may recall, is that every single Spanish ship was sunk. Now, part of that, of course, was by the weather, but it really is irrelevant whether it was weather or whether it was these privateering ships that Elizabeth had gotten together to fight the Spaniards. The point is that none of those ships got back. The loss of that money, in other words, just a dead-ass complete loss. Spain would never have recovered from that at all if they had not had their Philippine colony. So all of a sudden, the Philippines is not just a matter of a colonial expedition of the normal type, but at this point it's become the key to the survival of the Spanish monarchy itself. Now this is how the Philippines gets its name. In 1543, Ruy Lopez de Villalobos named the islands of Leyte and Samar Las Islas Filipinas after Philip II of Spain. Now Philip II became King of Spain on January 16, 1556, when his father, Charles I of Spain, abdicated the Spanish throne. Philip was in Brussels at the time, and his return to Spain was delayed until 1559 because of the European politics and wars in Northern Europe. Shortly after his return to Spain, Philip ordered an expedition mounted to Indonesia's Spice Islands, stating that its purpose was to discover the islands to the west. In reality, its task was to conquer the Philippines for Spain. On November 19, 1564, a Spanish expedition of 500 men, led by Miguel López de Legazpi, departed Barra de Navidad in New Spain, that is Mexico, arriving off Cebu on February 13, 1565, now conquering it despite Cebuano opposition. This expedition discovered the return route, as I mentioned before, across the Pacific Ocean. Now, in 1569, Legazpi transferred to Panay, Philippines, and founded a second settlement on the bank of the Panay River. In 1570, Legazpi sent his grandson, Juan de Salcedo, who had arrived from Mexico in 1567, to Mindoro to destroy the Muslim Moro pirates. These pirates had been plundering Panay villages. Salcedo also destroyed forts on the islands of Ilin and Lubang, respectively south and northwest of Mindoro. Now, that year, Martin de Goita, having been dispatched by Legazpi to Luzon, conquered the kingdom of Manila. Then it was called Manila, a puppet polity of the Sultanate of Brunei. Legazpi then made Manila the capital of the Philippines and simplified its spelling to Manila. Legazpi's expedition also renamed Luzon Nueva Castilla, that is, New Castile. Legazpi became the Philippines' first governor-general. So the Philippines now has the name Philippines. And there are powerful forces in the Congress in the Philippines today who would like to get a name that reflects neither Spanish or U.S. colonization and go back. So the bill actually proposes that they spend a year studying what a pre-European contact name that would be appropriate for the Philippines might be. Where that's going to go, I have no idea, but it's something interesting that you might want to be keeping an eye on over the next couple of years. Eventually, Cebu's trade importance shifted north to Luzon. The archipelago was Spain's outpost in the Orient, and Manila became the capital of the entire Spanish East Indies. The colony was administered through the Viceroyalty of New Spain, that is Mexico, until 1821, when Mexico achieved independence from Spain. After 1821, the Philippines colony was governed directly from Spain until the U.S. whipped them in 1898 and took the Philippines away from Spain and made it its own colony. Now, the galleon trade was inaugurated in AD 1565 between Manila and Acapulco, Mexico. Trade between Spain and the Philippines was via the Pacific Ocean to Mexico, Manila to Acapulco. Then cargo was offloaded and transported, and then the Mexican Isthmus to Veracruz, and reloaded for transport across the Caribbean Sea and Atlantic Ocean to Cadiz in Spain. Manila became the most important center of trade in Asia between the AD 1600s and 1700s. For 200 years, all sorts of products from China, Japan, Brunei, the Moluccas, and even India were sent to Manila to be sold for silver 8 real coins, which came aboard the galleons from Acapulco. These Asian goods, including silk, porcelain, spices, lacquerware, and textile products, were then sent to Acapulco, and from there to other parts of New Spain, Peru, and Europe. Meanwhile, the European population in the archipelago steadily grew, although native Philippine peoples remained the majority by far. During the initial period of colonization, 1,200 Spanish families settled Manila. In Cebu City, at the Visayas, 2,100 soldier settlers arrived from New Spain, Mexico. At the immediate south of Manila, Mexicans were present at Ermita and at Cavite, where they were stationed as sentries. In addition, men conscripted from Peru were also sent to settle Zamboanga City in Mindanao. Their task was to wage war upon Muslim pirates. After destroying them, they were to settle as a permanent garrison of guards. This entire interaction between the native Filipinos and immigrant Spaniards and Latin Americans resulted in the formation of a new language called Chavacano. Chavacano became a language of Mexican, Spanish, Filipino Creoles, that is, persons born in the New World or in the Philippines rather than peninsular Spain. They depended on the galleon trade for a living. In the later years of the AD 1700s, Governor-General Basco introduced economic reforms that gave the colony its first significant internal source of income. That money came from the production of tobacco and other agricultural exports. In this later period, agriculture was finally open to Europeans that before had been reserved for the native Philippines population. During Spain's 333-year rule in the Philippines, the colonists had to fight off the Chinese pirates who laid siege to Manila, the most famous of which was Limahong in 1574. They had to fight Dutch forces and Portuguese forces and indigenous revolts. Moros from western Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago also raided the coastal Christian areas of Luzon and the Visayas and occasionally captured men and women to be sold as slaves. Some Japanese ships visited the Philippines in the 1570s in order to export Japanese silver and import Philippine gold. Later, increasing imports of silver from the New World sources resulted in Japanese exports to the Philippines shifting from silver to consumer goods. In the 1580s, the Spanish traders were troubled to some extent by Japanese pirates, but peaceful trading relations were established between the Philippines and Japan by 1590. Japan's Kampaki, or regent, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, demanded unsuccessfully on several occasions that the Philippines submit to Japan's suzerainty. On February 8, 1597, King Philip II issued a royal cedula instructing Francisco de Tello de Guzman, then Governor-General of the Philippines, to fulfill the laws of tribute and to provide for restitution of ill-gotten taxes taken from the natives. The decree was published in Manila on the 5th of August of 1598. King Philip died on 13 September, just 40 days after the publication of that decree, but his death was not known in the Philippines until the middle of 1599, by which time a referendum by which the natives would acknowledge Spanish rule was underway. With the completion of the Philippine referendum of 1599, Spain could be said to have established legitimate sovereignty over the Philippines. And with that, I'm going to conclude this lecture on the autochthonous preparation for Philippine colonization by the Spaniards. And next lecture, we're going to talk about the Spanish-American-Cuban War, which gave the Yankees a road into Asia for the first time when they seized the Philippine colony from the Spaniards.